Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to dig into a story. It's a story about, well, cutting-edge engineering, but also a real sense of tragedy. We're talking about the Boeing 737 MX. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about the 737 MX. I mean, who hasn't?
What is it?
Big controversies, right? But we're going to go deeper here, past the headlines, and try to understand what made this plane, well, so revolutionary, but also what went so terribly wrong. And to help us unpack all of this, we have our expert with us. So when you think about the 737 MX, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
It's really quite interesting. The MAX, it wasn't some brand new idea like starting from scratch. It was more like Boeing's attempt to, take something that was already iconic, their legendary 737, and give it a refresh, a big update. And that decision to kind of like build on a legacy, well, that really set the stage for, everything that came after.
And so they're taking a classic, trying to bring it into the future. What was the main reason behind that, would you say?
Yeah.
What was driving that decision?
Fuel efficiency. It was all about fuel efficiency. Airbus had just come out with the A320neo, and it was a game changer when it came to fuel consumption. So Boeing, they had to respond to that challenge, and they had to do it quickly.
Makes sense. Airlines are always looking for an edge, ways to cut down on fuel costs. I mean, it's a huge chunk of their expenses, right? So how did Boeing go about this? Did they completely reinvent the wheel, or was it more about, making improvements to the existing design?
They were trying to find a balance, I think. They incorporated these new engines, the CFM International IL-8 engines, much quieter, much more fuel efficient. And they added those split-tip winglets, the ones you see on the MAX. Those were key for reducing drag, getting that fuel efficiency up.
Okay, so some pretty innovative updates there. Sounds good so far. So what was the catch? There's got to be a catch, right?
The catch was they didn't want to change too much. Boeing knew that pilot training, that's expensive. Airlines, they don't want to spend a ton of money retraining everyone. So they wanted to make the MAX, feel familiar to pilots who had been flying the older 737s, make that transition as smooth as possible.
Right, so a win-win. Better fuel efficiency, but pilots don't need to relearn everything. But wasn't that part of the problem in the end, that need to minimize retraining?
Yeah, you could say that. See, those new engines, the larger, more fuel-efficient ones, they had to be placed higher up on the wings, further forward compared to the older models, and that changed how the plane, how it behaved in the air, its aerodynamics. It created this tendency for the nose to pitch up in certain situations.
Okay, I think I see where this is going.
Yeah.
So they needed a way to counteract that pitch up, make the MAX handle more like the older 737s, and that's where MCS comes in.
Yeah.
Exactly. MCS, it stands for Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It was supposed to be, the solution to this problem. Basically, it was designed to automatically push the nose down if the plane started to pitch up too much.
Okay, but, and I think we all know where this is going, this system, this MCS, it had a pretty serious flaw. Could you explain that to us? What exactly went wrong?
The big issue was that MCS, it relied on data from just one sensor, one single angle of attack sensor. And if that sensor malfunctioned, well, the whole system, it was compromised.
Wait, so you're saying this sophisticated aircraft, this marvel of engineering, it had this single point of failure that could, bring the whole thing down?
It's like, imagine a chain. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And in this case, that one sensor, it was a major vulnerability. And unfortunately, it wasn't just a theoretical risk. That single point of failure, it would end up having, well, tragic consequences.
And those consequences, of course, were the devastating crashes of Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302. Now, before we get into those events, those heartbreaking events, let's step back for a second. When did the problems with MCS, when did those first become apparent? Was it right away, or was there a delay?
You see, that's the thing. There were some, I guess you could say, hints, little cues, that something wasn't quite right. But the real scope of the issue, just how serious this design flaw was, well, that didn't really become clear, tragically clear, until those accidents happened.
It's hard to fathom, that something like a single sensor malfunction could lead to such devastating consequences.
It really is.
So let's talk about those two flights, those tragedies. I think it's important to really grasp the human cost of, when engineering decisions go wrong.
I couldn't agree more. We're not just talking about like abstract concepts here, but about real people, families, lives that were forever changed by this.
The first crash, Lion Air Flight 610, it happened on October 29, 2018. Brand new 737 MX HE. It had just been delivered, like 2 months earlier. Takes off from Jakarta, Indonesia, headed for Pangkal Pinang. Can you walk us through what happened?
So just minutes after takeoff, that faulty angle of attack sensor, the one we were talking about, it starts sending bad data to the MCS system. It's telling the system that the plane is about to stall, even though it wasn't.
And MCS, which is designed to automatically push the nose down to prevent a stall, it kicks in, even though there was no stall to prevent.
Right. And the pilots, they suddenly find themselves fighting against these uncommanded movements. They had no warning, no clue why the plane was acting this way.
Because they hadn't been told about MCS, they hadn't been trained on how to handle a malfunction. Is that right?
Exactly. Boeing, they hadn't really fully explained the system to the airlines, hadn't provided specific training on it. So the pilots, they're in the dark, facing this hidden danger they didn't even know existed.
So they're thinking they're dealing with one thing, but really this automated system is working against them, pushing the nose down based on bad data. I can't even imagine being in that situation.
It must have been terrifying.
The flight recorder data shows they managed to pull the nose up a few times, but then MCS would reactivate and push it back down. It seems crazy that they didn't design the system to, like, recognize what the pilots were doing and respond to that.
And that's another big flaw in the original MCS design. It was designed to activate over and over again based on that single sensor reading, no matter what the pilots were doing to correct it.
So they're stuck in this loop, this terrifying loop, fighting against a system they don't understand, a system that ultimately, well, had the upper hand.
It did.
And tragically, Lion Air Flight 610, it crashes into the Java Sea, killing all 189 people on board.
Just a horrific tragedy. And what makes it even more tragic is that less than 5 months later, it happened again.
Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, another 737 MX. This time, it was on its way to Nairobi, Kenya, and crashed just minutes after takeoff from Addis Ababa. It's heartbreaking, but for the families who lost loved ones in these crashes, the similarities between them, it must have been just devastating. Same model, same problems with MCS, same tragic outcome.
You're right, the similarities were chilling. The same erratic climbs and dives, the pilots battling against this force they can't see or understand. It's all right there in the flight data recorder. A tragically familiar story.
Another brand new plane, another 157 lives lost. After this, the world had to take notice. The 737 MX problem, it was impossible to ignore.
Absolutely. This wasn't just bad luck anymore. This was a pattern, a systemic failure.
A wake-up call for the entire aviation world.
It was. And China, they were the first to ground the 737 MX.
That's an interesting detail, isn't it? That China took the lead on this, while other aviation authorities, I mean, even the FAA here in the U.S., they were hesitant at first. What do you think that says?
Well, it's complicated. Some experts think it might have been a cultural thing, different approaches to regulation, maybe a lower tolerance for risk in China, especially with their aviation sector growing so rapidly.
Interesting. Whatever the reason, it sent a big message, them grounding the plane.
It did. And it wasn't long before other countries started to follow suit. One by one, they grounded the 737 MX. It became clear this wasn't just a Boeing problem anymore. It was a global aviation crisis.
A crisis that would force everyone to take a long, hard look in the mirror. Boeing, the FAA, the whole industry, the 737 MX, the symbol of progress, it was grounded. And no one knew what the future held for it. It's a powerful image, isn't it? All those 737 MX jets grounded all over the world really drives home the seriousness of this. It was a wake-up call, not just for Boeing, but for everyone in aviation. So what happened right after the grounding? What were the immediate consequences?
Well, I mean, for Boeing, it was huge, obviously. Their best-selling plane grounded indefinitely. They were under a microscope, regulators, airlines, the public, everyone was watching.
Right. And I bet the financial hit was massive.
Oh, absolutely. Canceled orders, production cuts, compensation to airlines, families of the victims. It was a financial earthquake for Boeing. But you're right, it went way beyond money. This was about their reputation, their credibility, the whole future of the company, really.
So what did Boeing do? How did they address all of this?
They knew they had to act fast and they had to get it right. First things first, they had to fix that MCS software, so they redesigned it. Instead of relying on just one angle of attack sensor, the new system uses data from both of them. Makes it much harder for a single point of failure to cause a problem.
Which seems so obvious, doesn't it? I mean, looking back, you wonder why they didn't do that in the first place.
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people were asking. And the investigators, they spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. It seems like there were a few things that contributed, cost pressures, maybe a misunderstanding of how pilots would react to the system. Remember, the idea was for MCS to work in the background, kind of invisibly.
But that didn't work out so well.
No, it didn't. So they redesigned MCAS, but they also completely overhauled their pilot training programs. Now, there's mandatory training that focuses specifically on MCAS. Pilots learn how to recognize a malfunction and, most importantly, how to shut the system off if they need to.
So they finally recognized that pilots needed to know what the system was doing, be able to take control if it went haywire.
Absolutely. It was about giving the pilots back the control, giving them the knowledge, the tools to handle a situation like this.
It really makes you think about the role of automation, doesn't it? I mean, this whole crisis, it really forced a reassessment of how much we can rely on these automated systems.
No question. The 737 MAX crashes, they really got people talking, asking tough questions about how we design these systems, how we train pilots to use them, how much we should rely on them in the first place. And that conversation, it's still going on today.
So the MAX is flying again. What's different now? How has the aviation world changed because of all this?
Well, one of the biggest changes was on the regulatory side. The FAA, they took a lot of heat for how they handled the certification of the MAX. They had delegated a lot of the safety analysis, even the testing, to Boeing themselves.
Yeah, the whole fox guarding the henhouse problem.
Exactly. And the 737 MAX crisis, it showed how risky that approach could be. So since then, the FAA, they've been trying to do more, be more involved in the certification process, especially when it comes to these really complex safety critical systems.
So more independent verification, not just taking the manufacturer's word for it.
Right. And it's not just the FAA. Aviation authorities all over the world, they've been looking at their own processes, trying to figure out how to prevent something like this from happening again.
Sounds like the 737 MAX crisis really changed the way we think about aircraft safety in a big way.
It did. It forced a long overdue conversation about innovation, profit, and most importantly, about human life.
Those are big questions, no easy answers. What do you think will be the lasting impact of the 737 MAX story?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I think it's a powerful reminder that even with all the amazing technology we have, human judgment, human oversight, those are still absolutely essential. And it shows how important transparency is, clear communication, putting safety first from the design stage all the way through to training the pilots.
It's a powerful lesson, that's for sure. Technology is only as good as the people behind it, right?
Absolutely. And it's on all of us to make sure that we're using these technologies responsibly, ethically. The 737 MAX crisis was a tragedy, no doubt about it. But if it makes aviation safer, more transparent, more accountable in the future, well, then maybe something good can come of it.
Let's hope so. Thanks for taking us through all of this. It's been a really insightful deep dive. And for our listeners, if you're interested in learning more, we've got some links to additional resources in the show notes. And until next time, keep those questions coming, keep learning, and keep diving deep with us.